He watched from 50 yards away as they prepared the funeral, just another invisible groundskeeper in faded coveralls trimming hedges at Arlington. But when he saw which flag they were folding and which grave they were preparing, he dropped his tools and walked straight through the ceremony, and what he did next silenced 200 mourners. Don't forget to subscribe, and tell us which country and city you're watching from. The November morning arrived cold and gray over Arlington National Cemetery, the kind of weather that made the white headstones look even more stark against the frost-covered grass. Samuel Pritchard moved slowly along the pathways of Section 60, pushing his maintenance cart with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned not to rush anything anymore. At 69 years old, his body carried the accumulated weight of time, old injuries, and 20 years of bending over graves with hand tools and quiet respect. The coveralls he wore were faded olive green, patched at both knees, and his work boots had been resoled so many times the leather had molded perfectly to feet that had once marched through rice paddies half a world away. Most visitors to Arlington never noticed the groundskeepers. They were part of the landscape, like the trees or the eternal flame, present but invisible, tending the dead with a silence that seemed appropriate for such sacred ground. Samuel preferred it that way. He had taken the job 2 decades earlier, not because he needed the money, though the pension from 26 years in the Army only went so far, but because he needed to be near people who understood. The dead understood. They never asked questions. They never looked at him with pity or confusion. They just rested there beneath the white markers, and he made sure the grass around them stayed trimmed and the flowers families left were removed before they rotted. This particular morning, Samuel was working the eastern edge of Section 60, the area reserved for casualties from Iraq and Afghanistan. Younger graves, fresher grief. He had been trimming the same hedgerow for the past 40 minutes, moving with methodical precision, but his attention was not on the shears in his hands. 50 yards away, near the elm tree that marked the intersection of 2 pathways, a burial detail was setting up for a ceremony scheduled for 1000 hours. Samuel could see the honor guard assembling, 7 Marines in dress blues, their white gloves brilliant even in the overcast light. A chaplain stood near a lectern, reviewing his notes. Funeral home staff were unloading the casket from a hearse, and family members were beginning to arrive, clustering together against the cold. Samuel had witnessed thousands of burials during his 20 years at Arlington. He knew the rhythms, the protocols, the way grief moved through a family like a visible force. But something about this particular ceremony had caught his attention the moment the preparations began. He had recognized the flag being carried by the honor guard, the specific fold pattern indicating a Navy Cross recipient. He had seen the name on the schedule that morning when he checked in at the maintenance office. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, United States Navy, age 47, killed in action during a classified operation in the South China Sea. The name meant nothing to most people, but to Samuel it meant everything. The burial detail was positioning the casket near a grave that had been opened the previous afternoon. Standard procedure. The groundskeepers dug the graves. The funeral detail handled the ceremony. Everyone had their role. But as Samuel watched, he felt something tighten in his chest. The grave they were preparing was in the wrong location. He could see it from where he stood, the fresh earth piled beside a plot that was 3 rows too far north. They were going to bury Lieutenant Commander Webb in a space reserved for Army personnel, not Navy. The mistake was understandable. Section 60 had grown rapidly, the layout complex, the record-keeping sometimes imperfect, but it was still wrong. Samuel set down his head shears and wiped his hands on his coveralls. He could feel his heart rate increasing, that old familiar sensation from decades ago when something was about to go sideways and decisions had to be made quickly. He started walking toward the ceremony, his pace steady but purposeful, the limp from his left leg barely noticeable after so many years of living with it. The family members were taking their seats now, about 30 people in dark coats, their faces showing the particular exhaustion that comes from grief mixed with military formality. The widow sat in the front row, a woman in her mid-40s with 2 teenage children on either side of her. Her face was composed but fragile, holding together through sheer force of will. Samuel reached the edge of the ceremony area just as the chaplain stepped up to the lectern. No one looked at him. Groundskeepers were furniture, part of the background. The chaplain began speaking, his voice carrying across the cold morning air with practiced solemnity, talking about service and sacrifice and the debt the nation owed to those who gave everything. Samuel moved closer, positioning himself near the honor guard. One of the Marines, a lance corporal who could not have been more than 22, glanced at him with mild irritation, the way someone might look at a pigeon that had wandered too close to a formal event. The chaplain continued. Samuel waited. He knew he had perhaps 2 minutes before they would begin lowering the casket, before the mistake would become permanent. His hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Interrupting a military funeral was not done. It violated every protocol, disrespected the family, undermined the ceremony's dignity. But letting a Navy Cross recipient be buried in the wrong grave, away from his brothers, away from the plot that had been prepared for him next to men he had served with, that was a deeper violation. The chaplain finished his opening remarks. The honor guard stepped forward to begin the flag-folding ceremony. Samuel moved then, walking directly into the space between the casket and the honor guard, his work boots crunching on the gravel pathway. The movement was so unexpected, so out of place, that it took several seconds for anyone to react. The lance corporal started to reach for his arm, then hesitated, unsure of protocol for removing a cemetery groundskeeper from an active funeral. The chaplain stopped mid-sentence, his mouth opening in surprise. Samuel spoke, his voice low but carrying, roughened by years and weather but still possessing the command authority of someone who had once led men in combat. Wrong grave. 2 words, that was all. The honor guard lieutenant, a man in his early 30s with 3 rows of ribbons on his chest, stepped forward with barely controlled anger. "Sir, you need to leave immediately. This is a military funeral." Samuel did not move. He turned slightly to face the lieutenant, and something in his eyes, some quality of absolute certainty mixed with deep sadness, made the younger man hesitate. Samuel spoke again, still quiet, still that same weathered voice. "Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, Navy Cross, SEAL Team 3, died November 7th in classified maritime operation. He goes in plot 472 Echo, not here. This is Army section." The words landed like physical blows. The lieutenant's face changed, confusion replacing anger. How did a groundskeeper know any of that information? The name and date were public, but the unit designation, the classification level, the plot number, those details were not on any schedule accessible to cemetery maintenance staff. The lieutenant glanced at the grave, then at the paperwork on his clipboard, then back at Samuel. The family members were murmuring now, shifting in their seats, unsure what was happening. Samuel reached slowly into the chest pocket of his coveralls and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn soft from years of handling. He unfolded it carefully and held it out to the lieutenant. It was a printout from the Arlington National Cemetery plot registry, dated 20 years earlier, showing the layout of Section 60 with specific grave assignments marked in red ink. Plot 472 Echo was circled, with a note written in careful block letters. "Reserved for NSW personnel, Vietnam forward. Priority placement adjacent to plot 471 Echo." The lieutenant took the paper, studied it for a long moment, then pulled out his own cemetery map. He compared the 2 documents, his face growing pale as he realized the mistake. He turned to his staff sergeant. "Check the coordinates." The staff sergeant moved quickly to the open grave, pulled out a GPS unit, and verified the location. When he looked up, his expression confirmed what they were all beginning to understand. They were at the wrong grave. Samuel had been correct. The lieutenant turned back to Samuel, his anger completely gone now, replaced by professional concern and a growing sense of something else, something that looked like recognition. "How did you know?" Samuel folded the paper and returned it to his pocket. He did not answer the question directly. Instead, he turned and started walking, not away from the ceremony but toward a different section of the cemetery, about 40 yards south. The lieutenant hesitated, then made a quick decision. He signaled to the honor guard to hold position and followed Samuel, his boots clicking on the pathway. The chaplain followed. Then the funeral home director. Then, after a moment, the widow stood and began walking as well, her children supporting her on either side. The entire funeral procession began moving, following this old groundskeeper in faded coveralls towards some destination only he seemed to understand. Samuel led them along a curved pathway between rows of white headstones, past the graves of men and women who had died in distant wars, their names and dates marking out the cost of decades of conflict. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of this ground, who had walked these paths so many times they were burned into muscle memory. He stopped finally at a specific location, marked by a temporary stake with a number tag. Plot 472 Echo. The grave here had been opened yesterday, just like the other one, fresh earth piled neatly to the side, a green carpet of artificial grass arranged around the opening to hide the raw dirt during the ceremony. Samuel stopped at the head of the grave and turned to face the group that had followed him. The widow was there, her face showing confusion mixed with something else, a desperate hope that maybe, somehow, this strange interruption meant something important. The honor guard had reformed around the new location, their movements automatic, professional. The chaplain was checking his notes, adapting quickly to the change. Samuel stood silently for a moment, then reached down and touched the headstone next to plot 472 Echo. The marker read, Senior Chief Petty Officer Raymond Webb, United States Navy, SEAL Team 3, February 12, 1948, March 23, 2004. The widow gasped. She moved forward, her legs almost giving out, her children holding her up. She stared at the headstone, then at Samuel, then at the open grave beside it. That's my father-in-law. Marcus never knew where he was buried. The Navy said the plot information was classified because of his operations. We've been trying to find it for years. Samuel nodded slowly. He knew. He had always known. 20 years ago, when he took this job, the first thing he did was locate this grave, memorize its location, and make sure it was maintained perfectly. He came here every morning, often before dawn, and checked the flowers, trimmed the grass, made sure the headstone stayed clean. He had done this for 2 decades, waiting for the day when another name would join this one, when the son would finally rest beside the father, when a promise made long ago in blood and mud could finally be kept. The lieutenant was staring at Samuel now with open curiosity mixed with growing respect. He had pulled out his phone and was quietly making calls, speaking in the clipped, efficient language of military coordination. Within minutes, new paperwork was being generated, the burial detail was being officially updated, and the ceremony was being reset at the correct location. But through all of this, the lieutenant kept glancing at Samuel, clearly trying to piece together how a cemetery groundskeeper possessed this level of knowledge about classified SEAL operations and family connections that even the Navy had lost track of. The ceremony began again, this time at the correct grave. The chaplain adapted his remarks, speaking now about fathers and sons, about legacies of service that passed through generations, about the brotherhood that extended beyond death. The honor guard performed the flag folding with precision, each movement sharp and reverent. The volleys were fired, 3 shots that echoed across the cemetery and sent birds scattering from the trees. Taps played, the single bugler standing on a small rise, the notes hanging in the cold air like something physical. When the flag was presented to the widow, folded into the perfect triangle that every military family knows, she held it against her chest and wept. Not the quiet tears she had been holding back all morning, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place beyond protocol or dignity, the sound of grief finally finding release. Her children held her, and the other family members surrounded them in a protective circle, and for a moment, the ceremony dissolved into something more human, more real than any formal ritual could contain. Samuel stood apart from all of this, back near the tree line, hands clasped in front of him. He had done what he came to do. The grave was correct. The son rested beside the father. The promise was kept. He started to turn away, to return to his head shears and his maintenance cart and his invisible life among the dead. But the widow's voice stopped him. Wait, please. She had separated from her family and was walking toward him, still holding the folded flag, her face streaked with tears but her eyes clear and direct. Samuel stopped. He did not want this conversation. He had spent 20 years avoiding exactly this kind of attention, but something in her expression told him she would not be denied. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the resemblance to her husband in the shape of her eyes, close enough that he could see she was younger than he had thought, maybe early 40s, aged by grief but still carrying herself with strength. Who are you? Samuel hesitated. The question was simple, but the answer was complicated, layered with decades of history and decisions that could not be easily explained. He could lie. He could give his name and title and walk away. But standing there, with her husband freshly buried and her father-in-law's grave finally identified, lies seemed impossible. I served with Raymond Webb. Long time ago. The widow shook her head. The answer was not enough. She could sense there was more, could feel the weight of something unspoken hanging between them. How did you know where he was buried? How did you know my husband should be here? Samuel looked past her, toward the 2 graves, father and son now united in death. His voice when he spoke was distant, remembering. Raymond and I went through buds together. Class 42, 1968. We were young and stupid and thought we were invincible. We went to Vietnam together, ran operations up and down the Mekong Delta, did things that still don't have names in the official record. On our last operation, April 1971, we walked into an ambush, 4-man team. Raymond was point, I was tail. The 2 men between us died in the first 30 seconds. Raymond took 3 rounds pulling me out, saved my life, destroyed his back doing it. He got medical retirement. I got to keep serving. The widow was crying again, but silently now, tears running down her face as she listened. Samuel continued, the words coming easier now, like water finding a path through long blocked channels. Raymond went home, got married, had a son, Marcus, named him after a teammate who died on that last operation. Raymond wrote me letters for years, told me about his family, about his son wanting to follow in his footsteps. I was still active, still running operations, couldn't always respond. But I read every letter. When Raymond died in 2004, I was deployed, classified location, couldn't come to the funeral, didn't even know where they buried him until I got back stateside 6 months later and found out he was here, in Arlington, in a section restricted because of his classified service record. Samuel paused, his hands trembling slightly. The widow reached out and placed her hand on his arm, a gesture of comfort and permission to continue. Samuel took a breath. Marcus reached out to me when he graduated Bud, said his father had told him about me, said he wanted to serve like we did. I tried to talk him out of it, tried to tell him the cost was too high, but he had his father's stubbornness. We stayed in touch over the years, not often, maybe a message every few months. Last time I heard from him was 3 weeks before he died. He told me he was getting ready for a priority mission. Didn't say what, didn't have to. I knew the tone, I knew what it meant, and I knew if it went wrong, he'd end up here and he'd want to be next to his father. The widow was nodding now, understanding beginning to replace confusion. Samuel pulled out his wallet, old leather cracked and worn, and withdrew a photograph protected in plastic. He handed it to her. The image showed 2 young men in combat fatigues, their faces lean and hard, weapons slung across their shoulders, standing in front of a camouflaged patrol boat. They were smiling, the kind of smile that came from surviving something terrible together. That's me and Raymond, 1970, Mekong Delta. The widow stared at the photo, then looked up at Samuel, really seeing him for the first time, past the age and the weathered face and the groundskeeper coveralls. Seeing the young warrior he had been, the man her father-in-law had trusted with his life. You've been here 20 years, maintaining his grave, waiting for Marcus. Samuel nodded. There was nothing else to say. The widow folded the photograph carefully and handed it back, but Samuel shook his head. Keep it. Marcus should have it. She clutched the photo to her chest, adding it to the folded flag she was already holding, 2 pieces of history now joined. The lieutenant had approached during this conversation, had been listening with growing understanding. He stood at attention now and addressed Samuel with formal respect. Sir, what was your rank and unit? Samuel was quiet for a long moment. He had spent 20 years being invisible, being just another groundskeeper in faded coveralls, and the idea of claiming his past felt wrong, like putting on clothes that no longer fit. But the question had been asked with genuine respect, and the young lieutenant deserved an answer. Master Chief Petty Officer Samuel Pritchard, SEAL Team 1, later SEAL Team 6. 26 years active duty, retired 1994. The lieutenant's face changed completely. He came to sharp attention and saluted with a precision that made the movement seem like something more than protocol, something more like recognition of a debt that could never be repaid. The other members of the honor guard, realizing what they were witnessing, snapped to attention as well. The elderly Master Chief who had just interrupted their ceremony was not a groundskeeper. He was one of the originals, one of the men who had helped build the legend that every current SEAL still lived by. Samuel returned the salute slowly, his arm moving with the stiffness of age but the precision of old training. When he lowered his hand, the lieutenant spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. Master Chief, on behalf of Naval Special Warfare, thank you for your service. And thank you for bringing Commander Webb home to the right place. Samuel nodded once. He turned to leave, but the widow stopped him again, her voice urgent. Will you visit, please? Come tell us more about Raymond, about that time. Marcus grew up on those stories, but there was so much his father wouldn't talk about. Classified, he always said, but maybe now. Samuel hesitated. For 20 years he had avoided exactly this kind of connection, this kind of entanglement with the living. The dead were easier. The dead did not ask questions or expect things he could not give. But looking at the widow's face, seeing the same determination her husband had carried, the same strength her father-in-law had shown in that muddy river 40 years ago, he found himself nodding. Maybe. Sometime. It was not much of a promise, but it was more than he had given anyone in 2 decades. The widow seemed to understand. She squeezed his arm once, a gesture of gratitude and connection, then returned to her family. Samuel watched as the ceremony concluded, as the family filed past the grave one final time, as the honor guard performed their final salute and marched away in formation. When the last of them had gone, When he was alone again among the white headstones, he approached the two graves side by side. He knelt slowly, his old knees protesting, and placed one hand on Raymond's headstone and one hand on the fresh earth covering Marcus's casket. He stayed that way for several minutes, not praying exactly, but communicating something that had no words, making good on a promise that had taken 40 years and countless mornings of solitary maintenance to fulfill. When he finally stood, his face was wet, though he could not have said when the tears had started. He walked back to his maintenance cart, picked up his head shears, and resumed his work. By noon, the ceremony area was empty. By evening, new flowers had been placed on both graves, though no one had seen who brought them. And the next morning before dawn, an old man in faded coveralls arrived at Section 60 and began his rounds, checking every grave in his section with the same careful attention he had given for 20 years. But now, finally, the waiting was over. The son rested beside the father. The circle was complete. And Samuel Pritchard, Master Chief Petty Officer retired, continued his invisible work among the honored dead, carrying his own wars in silence, tending the gardens of sacrifice that stretched across Arlington's sacred hills. Some promises, he had learned, took a lifetime to keep. Some debts could never be repaid, only honored through small acts of faithfulness repeated across years until the weight of them became something like peace. The graves stood side by side, father and son, their stories known now to those who needed to know them, their names carved in stone that would outlast memory. And every morning before the visitors arrived, an old groundskeeper made sure their section of ground remained perfect, their headstones clean, their sacrifice remembered. It was not much, but it was everything he had left to give. In the years that followed, other families would find him working in Section 60, would see the care he took with each grave, the way he moved through the rows as if walking through a reunion of old friends. Some would ask his name. Most would simply nod and move on, understanding that some men served the living while others served the dead, and both were necessary. Samuel Pritchard had chosen his post, and held it with the same dedication he had once brought to missions that had no names and operations that left no records. The wars he had fought were over, but the watch continued, and that, he had finally learned, was enough.